Okay, so this is Working Backwards Inside Stories and Secrets from Inside Amazon by Colin Bryar and Bill Carr. So these were both like top execs at Amazon. Colin Bryar was Jeff Bezos' shadow. He was the chief of staff to Jeff Bezos, basically from when they went from like year four when they were bookseller U.S. only to kind of international. And sorry about that. And yeah, I just wanted to talk about, I had actually recorded a much longer podcast, um, but I lost it all to the ether as it goes. so I'm just going to talk about the two main things. There's a lot of great stuff in this book about how Amazon operates, their hiring process, and what they call the bar raiser, and a lot of stuff around innovation and the customer experience. But I really want to talk about two main things that I'm taking away from this book. So the first one is, and I'll just focus on these two chapters. So the way this book is set up is there's a first part and a second part. The first part is all about the principles that Amazon kind of operates on, and the second part is kind of how those principles applied during the development of like Amazon Music, Kindle, AWS, some of the bigger initiatives, the Fire Phone, which is an obvious failure for Amazon. But I just want to talk about the first part and specifically as chapter 5 and chapter 6. So chapter 5 is called Working Backwards, and it's, I'll just quote this, so central to the company's success that we used it as the title for our own book. And actually, unquote. And so Colin Bryar, I think, or no, Bill Carr actually formed an LLC called Working Backwards. So it's kind of his, I guess, a funnel or consulting kind of thing. But okay, so what is the Working Backwards, framework, or how did this develop? And so actually, how it started was there was people would present PowerPoints to Jeff Bezos, and he would often think that it's like very lacking in detail. They'd also found that that it really depended on how persuasive the person was, right? So you really want to pick the best initiatives, not who happens to pitch it. So anyway, the story is that Jeff Bezos started asking for mock-ups, and mock-ups are just kind of like low fidelity, screenshots of what the product will look like. And he had the saying, "A half-baked mock-up is half-baked thinking," and so I mean, it sounds like he was pretty ruthless with his criticism. But not only was it a problem of people hadn't really thought through all the issues, it was also that people would end up debating just kind of trivial things like, hey, this button should be blue instead of green. And so they actually, I think it was Colin Bryar and Bezos were reading a book by Edward Tufte. I think that's his name, Tufte. He's written a bunch of super interesting stuff on how to present data visually. And basically, it was sort of this idea that the actual essay with maybe a few charts was like the most like information dense way to present something. And so they ended up moving to this format called the press release PR/FAQ. And it's basically a 6-page document. So the way this works is the document basically is a press release as if they're releasing the product right today, and then the FAQ is just a bunch of questions customers might have about the product. Like as an example, the press release might say, today Amazon is releasing a new e-ink reader called Kindle, right? And then the FAQ might be, how will I buy books, right? Oh, answer, you can buy them on Amazon.com. Question, how will I sync my books to my device? Do I need a cable? Answer, no, you get free, Wi-Fi signal on included with no subscription fee. So the kind of typical thing in tech, has been, build it and they will come, and that's obviously not played out recently, and that's kind of why we have stuff like the Lean Startup, which is rapid iteration and rapid feedback from customers. But they're dealing with a lot of logistical things where you can kind of anticipate what the customer is going to say. Stuff like will customers want cheaper shipping or more expensive shipping, right? It's pretty obvious, right? Well, they want stuff faster or slower. They probably want stuff faster. So they ended up with this format where the person who's presenting, instead of presenting a PowerPoint or a mock-ups or whatever, presents a document, and maybe there's some graphs in there, but I think they're going to be pretty light in this PR FAQ format. Now, what's really interesting is how they actually use it. So what they do is at the start of the meeting, they distribute this document. And it's a max of 6 pages, because it turns out that most people read at about 3 pages per minute. So, 3 minutes per page. And so if you have 6 pages, that's 18 minutes, right? 6 times 3. So, and most meetings are an hour, right? So it's basically like a third of the meeting gets devoted, the first 20 minutes gets devoted to just reading. And so everyone gets distributed the document at the start of the meeting. Now, what's interesting, and then there's complete silence, right? For the first 20 minutes, everyone sits there just reading a document for the first 20 minutes. How weird is that, right? But what's super interesting is they don't give it out beforehand, because they found that if they did, there'd be some people who'd like eagerly read it and take a bunch of notes, and then other people who it wouldn't be a high priority for them, so they wouldn't read it. So by doing this format, it's kind of left everyone on a stable vantage point. But the real advantage of this format is that they can rapidly iterate, because it actually surfaces all the problems very quickly, right? So when the people read it, they also take notes at the start of the meeting, and then they discuss those issues as the meeting goes on. And so instead of needing to build a product and then you kind of see it, or maybe stuff is left out of wireframes, or like a PowerPoint often doesn't even get into a lot of the details, right? So, so it's a way to surface these problems like quickly, and that also means you can iterate on the product idea very quickly, right? Just the way you'd have a conversation about it. And later they added this idea of the internal versus the external FAQ. So, and it should be said that the real reason that this whole thing is important is because it takes you to the end point and the way the customer would see it. And this is one of the things that's obviously make Amazon so successful, is this obsession with the customer obsession, right? So it's actually looking at this product from the lens of the customer. Why would the customer want this thing? And this is the biggest thing in tech, is that people are never thinking about the actual end user. They're always thinking about what their technology does. Steve Jobs also had a thing about this, where he talked about, I've made this mistake more than anyone else. You can't start from the technology and try to find your way to the customer. You have to start with the customer and work your way back. So it's kind of funny, like Steve Jobs was saying exactly the same thing as the point of this book, right? Just in a different company and kind of in a different guise. But yeah, so they had this internal and external FAQ. The external FAQ were all the questions the customer would have. The internal was like, how are we actually going to pull this off? How are we going to build it? And what's also really interesting about this is that it kind of focuses in on one of their main principles, which is to think long term and to think for the customer. So this document isn't about how much money it's going to make the company. It's actually how it's going to benefit some future customer, right? So they're really not focused on kind of the P&L, although sometimes I think it gets talked about. And so what's also interesting is that there's like going to be a ton of revisions of this stuff, and it's expected there are a lot of revisions, because you're going to find gaps in your thinking about how you're going to build something or why a customer wants something. And they actually say most of these initiatives actually go to die. They never get built. And they say this is a feature, not a bug, which is pretty interesting, right? So kind of along the lines of, another big principle with Amazon is this principle of invention. And a little quote I had is, being Amazonians, that's what they call someone who is kind of embodying these principles, is a flexible mindset. and this was Jeff Bezos, we need to plant many seeds because we don't know which of those seeds will grow into a mighty oak. So there's this idea that, when you're inventing, most things won't work out, and that's totally okay, right? Um, so another big idea from this book was that you can either be in technology, you can either be a fast follower or you can be an inventor, right? So you can either create stuff yourself or you can kind of quickly follow those who invent stuff, and kind of in a 0 to 1 idea, um, who. In a 0 to 1 idea, to have pricing power, you need to be different than everyone else. So how are you going to do that? And Jeff Bezos's idea was you need to invent, right? And that allows you to be N of one, and that gives you competitive advantage, right? And gives you something unique for the customer. So um, the other main principle that I want to talk about, and before I go on to that, though, I just want to say that kind of a I've started to use this PR FAQ format for things that I want to do in my life, things I'm thinking about doing in my business. And what's really interesting, or I should say businesses, one thing that's really interesting is, so I'm having Chat GPT. I just tell Chat GPT, hey, build me a 6-pager, in the PR FAQ Amazon format of this thing I want to do, this initiative. And it spits out, the 6-page document. Then I'll print that out and I'll actually read through it. And it's super interesting because it's surfacing, even if ChatGPT doesn't surface it, it causes me to surface, hey, this is going to be a problem here. And I haven't really thought about it, right? I haven't really thought about this problem. Or, it's mentioning this problem, but I don't think that's the real problem. The real problem is going to be this, right? And so it's getting me to think through the future and what the problems will be with doing this. And I've already noticed that some of these things, I'm like, oh, I was ready to do that thing, but now that I've thought more about it, I can see kind of the potholes, right? I see the problems that I might run into, and maybe I still want to do it, maybe I don't, right? But now I can at least anticipate those things, and so. All right, so the second main idea that I really took away from this book is chapter 6, and it's all on metrics, but it's not metrics per se, because they have this whole framework for define, measure, analyze, improve, control. That's kind of their framework for creating metrics, and how they have this thing called the weekly business review where they review all their metrics and whatever. Um, but the big kind of takeaway is this output versus input metrics. And they talk about how Wall Street is often looking at output metrics, like, how much profit, how much free cash flow, and that kind of stuff. So, Wall Street would focus on, output metrics. Like an example would be the stock price, right? That's the ultimate output metric, free cash flow or the profits. But, the real input metrics are sort of things like, convenience, right? How many products do they have? What's the price of those products? What kind of margins are they operating on? And later on, they moved on to like internal and external input metrics. So like an internal, external one might be like how quick the site loads, right? Or what price it is to the customer. But like an internal one might be like what kind of gross margins are they making? So. But yeah, the more I think about this, like so often goal setting, if we think about goal setting just in a personal domain, not so much in a corporate domain, but is often based on, output metrics. But really what kind of moves the needle is the input, right? And it reminds me of the kind of Benjamin Graham quote, that the stock market short term is a voting machine, long term it's a weighing machine, right? So a company can be totally undervalued, and it's just because of whatever the fad is today. But eventually, the stock price will catch up to what the fundamental value of something is, and so it's kind of the same way. Where this also ties into long-term thinking. It's one of the main principles behind Amazon is that you might be misunderstood for long periods of time, but eventually, if you really are serving the customer, that your stock price will catch up. And so the outputs will kind of catch up to the input. And so just thinking, connecting this to another book called The Motivation Myth. In that book, the author argues that basically top performers, and it was mainly in sports, but top performers mainly focus, they do set goals, but then they quickly forget about the goals and they just focus on the day-to-day inputs. As an example, like maybe there's someone who, sure, they want to, win the Olympics in sprinting, but then, what are they focusing on day to day? They don't sit around thinking about the goal, kind of manifesting the goal, right? They actually just like go to the track. They run their sprints, they do their weightlifting, like all the inputs that are actually involved. And so, sure, they did set a goal. There is some output metric, right? But that's not what they think about day to day. They actually just focus on the inputs and they actually kind of forget about the goal, right? And so, anyway, that's one of the main ideas I have from this book. There's a lot of great stuff in this book about hiring, more about metrics, all kinds of interesting things about the principles, thinking long term, customer obsession, invention, and failure. I think there's great stuff in this book. One thing I'm really realizing is how all of the great companies have figured out ways to basically subvert politics and get to the truth. And Amazon has its own unique ways of doing that. One of the ways is through this working backwards process, right? There's also really interesting stuff around hiring, how when individual people do the recruiting, they do the hiring interviews, they don't talk to each other about the candidate. So, to not bias each other. This idea of metrics, and they actually look for, both metrics, but then anecdotes too. And they'll have every person in the executive team, they'll do like, I think it's maybe 1 week a year, 1 week every few years, they actually go and become a customer representative, which is a very obviously low paying job, just to get these anecdotes, right? So there's also stories about how Jeff Bezos would always speak last, so he wouldn't influence everyone else, right? What I'm getting to is that all these companies, whether it's Amazon and Steve Jobs with Pixar, with Apple, Ray Dalio has this in Principles. He talks a lot about their Bridgewater's decision weighted matrix and their baseball cards and all that stuff. They all have unique ways of getting to the truth and not letting politics get involved. So I figured I'd just go right to the conclusion on, how do I start? Where do I start? What do I actually do to bring some aspects of being Amazonian into my business? So I'll just read these first points. Here are a few suggestions. Ban PowerPoint as a tool to discuss complicated topics and start using 6-page narratives and PR FAQ documents in your leadership team meetings. Number 2, establish the bar raiser hiring process. So I haven't really talked about that, but basically every person should be better than, where you're at right now. So you should always be hiring someone better than you, right? Focus on controllable input metrics. Yeah, that's one thing I didn't mention, is that all the input metrics should be controllable, right? There are going to be some where you can't really control, right? The cost of a good from an external supplier, you can't control that, right? But you can control, like, how fast the page loads. You can control how much you mark it up, stuff like that. And then, this idea of, trial and error. There's a lot of trial and error and tinkering that obviously gets involved with invention. And so that's one of the kind of interesting aspects of this, because the working backwards is not a tinkering trial and error. It's actually thinking like, from the end and trying to reverse your way back. But there is a lot of trial and error in terms of, how you go about modifying that. And they talk a lot about how their principles actually, didn't just start as like documents, but have become uncovered and have changed over time. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh yeah, the flywheel. Depict your flywheel. What are the drivers of growth for your company? Make a picture of them that shows how they act upon the flywheel. Evaluate everything you do in light of its positive or negative effects on one or more drivers of the flywheel. Yeah, so anyway, great book. Really interesting seeing inside Amazon. lots of stuff I didn't touch on. I actually had recorded like an hour-long podcast before this that got lost to the ether because I essentially forgot to hit record or something. I don't know, but yeah, these are the main topics. I think the working backwards. If there's one thing you can do today is think about some big change you're trying to make, and go into ChatGPT and ask, describe it in a few sentences, and then ask ChatGPT for a 6-page or a PR FAQ in Amazon style, and see what it spits out, and then read through it and take notes on it. And I'm sure you'll gain some insight about problems that you might have encountered, or things that won't work, or ways you can modify it. So, all right, that's it for today.